One of the important parts in our Python learning curve is learning how to work with data bigger than we can type. So sometimes we download that, sometimes we build that, sometimes somebody gives it to us, but learning how to put that into an external data file and how to bring that into our Python script, or how to use our Python script to write those data files, is a really, really important next step. So today, let's take a look at files. Well, as soon as we have more data than we want to type, that means working with external data files. Later, we may even graduate and go to something even fancier like a database. But for right now, we'll just work with some files. The general idea is pretty simple, actually. We have a Python script here in the red on the left, and we have some external data in this other file on the right. Now, it could be anything, right? It could be the complete works of Shakespeare. It could be a million tweets. The one we're going to work with here in just a minute is about 110,000 words. But whatever it is, there's too much stuff for us to type. And so what we want is to bring that external data file into the Python script so that we can work with it. Now, traditionally, there's a 3-step process to do this. We open that external data file, and then we process it in some way, and then we close it. And typically what happens is that when we open a file, we get this kind of metaphoric pipeline. It's just a path that the data can take to get to and from our Python script. So we will open a file, and what that does is to build this metaphoric pipeline. And then we can either read or write data. If we read data, we are moving it from the green file on the right into our Python script on the left. So reading leaves the data file alone. We're just, as it were, importing the data. But write is different. Write pushes data from the script on the left to the file on the right. It creates or adds to or even overwrites the data that was there to begin with. And then when we're done, we will close that pipeline. You could think about it as closing that little knob there, but even the pipeline might even just go away. Either metaphor is fine. Now, Python has 2 ways to work with those external data files. There's an old way and there's a new way. And I just want to be really upfront. I am going to explain to you the old way because I want you to know what happens in this 3-step process. And we're going to do it this way first here in just a minute. And then we're going to learn the new way, the with context generator. And just to be upfront, I will do it the new way for the entire rest of the semester, as you probably will too. However, just to understand what happens when we work with data files, I do want to step through the old way first, just to show you what's going to happen. So let's flip over to the terminal window and do a little bit of that. Data files can contain pretty much anything that we want to. It could be audio, it could be video, it could be a giant novel, it could be mapping data, it could even be secretly encrypted stuff. It doesn't really matter. Here, we're just going to be working with a plain text file. It's called lexicon.txt, and it's available to you on eClass. So if you want to play along, and I recommend that you do, go to eClass and download lexicon.txt and just put it somewhere where you're working on all of your other Python stuff so that you can find it. And we'll talk about that here again in just a minute. You can see, though, that this is a really simple file. There's just a plain text file. It's just a bunch of words. There are some apostrophes in there, maybe a little bit of punctuation. They're all oddly in alphabetical order, and there's about 110,412 of them. And so it's a reasonable file. If I wanted to look at a little bit more about my data, I happen to be using BBEdit today, but you can use any editor you want to, and they'll be slightly different here. In BBEdit, I just want to go in and I want to go into text display and I wanted to show the invisibles. And what you can see at the end of every line here is that BBEdit puts a little gray kind of an elbow-shaped symbol here. That's how BBEdit displays a new line character. Now, when those come into Python later, we'll represent a new line character as a \n. But I always like to take a peek at my data here to see if I can see what that data is structured like. So here, it's pretty clean. It's one word per line, but there's a new line at the end of every word. And so that's something I'm probably going to clean up later. Now, back in my terminal window, I can check to see if I'm in the right place for to work with that data file. And in fact, I am. I've already taken the time to change directories over here. But if you're not, remember where you downloaded your file to, and in the command line do a change directories so you can get into the right place. I've already done that. And so what I'm going to do now is get into the Python command line interpreter, and we'll go through that 3-step process the old-fashioned way. We'll bring in this data file into Python, and then we'll go back to the slideshow and we'll take a look more closely at what we just happened to do. But I suggested that the first thing we need to do is just open a metaphoric pipeline. And so I'm going to do that. I'm going to create a variable here called pipeline. And I'm going to tell Python to open the file called lexicon.txt. I already know I'm in the right place. I know it can read lexicon.txt. And I don't get an error. So that tells me that that pipeline has been created. So there is a kind of mode of communication between my Python right here and that external plain text data file that's on my hard drive. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to read data from that pipeline. So I don't know why I want to make that plural. There's only one. So I want Python to go on that pipeline to read all the lines in that file and bring them into a new variable called words. Now, readlines is going to create a list. So words will be a list in the end, which means that I can slice it. So let's take a look at the first, I don't know, 40 words or so. And there you go. There it is. And you can see now all of those \n characters in there. So there are lots and lots of new lines on there. And in fact, if I ask how many words did we get, there's 110,412. That seems reasonable because that's the same number we saw a little bit earlier. Now, that pipeline to that data file is still open. But I don't need it to be open. And in fact, I actually do want to close it, because as long as that pipeline to that file is open, there is the possibility of damaging that file. There's the possibility of contaminating that file. And I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to, it's singular. I'm going to tell the pipeline to close itself. So a 3-step process. I open the pipeline. I either read or write from the pipeline. I need to create a variable, or maybe sometimes multiple variables in my Python script so that I can accept that data. And then I close the pipeline. And we're all set. So let's go back to the slideshow and let's just take a little look through what we just did here. Right, well, what we just did was to work with that data file in the old way using this 3-step process. And I just want to talk through that a little bit so that you really understand what's happening at that moment. The first step that we did was to actually open a connection, I called it a pipeline, to that external file. I'm going to get away from the metaphor of calling it a pipeline because, as we'll see in just a couple of minutes, it's really more like a file object. That's maybe a smarter way to think about the thing that we're creating. When I tell Python to open a connection, though, I need to tell Python 2 things. And so inside the parentheses, there are 2 parameters, 2 bits of data that I need to give Python so that it can open a connection properly. The first one, as we already saw, was the name of the file. Ours was lexicon.txt. And you'll notice there's a second one here, which is a mode. I actually need to tell Python if I want to read from the file or write to the file, or do a bunch of any other things to the file. Now, the way that this is delineated here, it's mode equals R. And what that tells me, if I looked up in the documentation, it says that unless I specify otherwise, the mode will be R for read. So if I don't specify, Python will say, oh, he's reading from that file. But if I want to write or if I want to do some other things, I must be explicit there and tell Python which mode I want. Which are the modes? There's a bunch. So R stands for read, and you'll notice if I don't say anything, Python assumes it will be R for read. W makes sense, which is write, but you'll notice too that a write will erase the file. So if you had any data in there to begin with, it's all gone, and now I'm writing new data to that file. I can do R plus and W plus, so I can actually read and write at the same time. I can set the mode to A, which is to append data, sort of like appending to a list. Everything just goes right to the end of the file. Or if I'm working with images or multimedia stuff, audio, video, maybe some other things as well, I can actually use a B mode, which says that I'm using binary data. That means it shouldn't interpret that as text or anything else. So this is a really important component, but this is the thing you need to remember. Even in the new way, I do need to open a connection to that file, and I need to tell Python what is the name of the file, and I need to tell it which mode I'm using. Now, if I'm reading, I can omit the mode. I can leave it off. If I'm writing or appending or reading it in binary, I cannot leave out the mode. I have to put a character, a string in there to tell Python what I want to do with it. The second step that we did was to read data from the file. And again, that brings data from that external file into my Python script. And I've got several options here too. The one I used was read lines. And so that takes every line in that file and it creates a list, which I put into a variable called words. That's what I chose to get from my data structure. But you'll notice that I've got other options here too. I could read the entire file into one giant long string. And sometimes, if I'm working with text, that's actually what I want to have happen. I could also read one line at a time. So maybe there are so many lines in that data file, and I don't perhaps want them all. Maybe I want to select certain lines out of that file. I can just read them one at a time and then process each line as I get it. So I've got several different options here for reading data. And you'll notice, and I said down here at the bottom, that Python will interpret that new line character and it will bring it in as that \n character. And we've already seen that. There are tons of those in that file. These are some of those other special characters. \n is the classic new line character, especially if you're using any kind of Unix or Linux-based system or a Macintosh. If you're on a Windows system, the Windows system actually uses a 2-character sequence, the \r\n, as a new line character. And one of the cool things about Python is that Python will convert that automatically to a \n. So for those of you who are working on Windows, you'll probably never see that \r\n, but under the hood, it's actually still there. That's all right. Python is helping us out here. And then we've seen this a little bit before too when we were working with strings. \t is a tab character. Now, there are some other / special characters, but these are the ones that you're going to see the most often. Now, if we're going to write data, we've got really two options here. We have a write method, which writes a giant long string to that file. Or we could write lines, which is writing a list of data to the file. And you'll notice in both of these that we actually have to append that \n. Python won't add that for us automatically. But these are how we write to the file. And then, of course, at the end, we need to close it. So this is really actually more important than you might think. It preserves the file and it saves it. It makes sure that we're not damaging the file or accidentally deleting it or accidentally overwriting it in some way. And so it's just a safety mode. Now, it's so important that in the new version of working with files, Python will do it for us automatically. But in the old-fashioned way, we have to do it ourselves. All right, so let's just take a look at how we do it the new way, and then we'll jump back into the terminal window and do a little practice. And that new way uses a thing called a context manager. Now, the keyword that we're going to use is with. And so you can see a little bit of code here. And what I'm telling Python, in effect, is, hey, with the following file, I want you to perform all the lines of the block. And then, when all the lines of the block are finished, I just want you to close the file for me automatically. So let's just step through the little component pieces of what this means. Right out of the gate, you can see that this is just the classic setup for a block. Instead of using a keyword like while or for or conditionals if, else, we're just using the keyword with. And you'll notice at the end of that line, there's a colon. I know it's hard to see, but there's a colon there. And so this is the classic setup for a block. Everything underneath it will be indented. I only have one line here, but I could have 5 or 10 or 100. It doesn't really matter. You'll notice too, though, that I'm still opening the file in exactly the same way that I was before. I have to pass it a file name, or more precisely a path. And because I have not specified the mode here, Python knows that the mode is R for read. Could I open it with W for write, or A for append, or B for binary? Absolutely, yeah, I could. No problem. Piece of cake. Python doesn't care one bit. You'll notice, though, that I'm also doing a thing here called aliasing. I'm creating an alias for that file object. This is a lot like assigning it to a variable. And if you want to think of the word file here as a variable, that makes tons of sense. Remember earlier we did it the old-fashioned way, and I created a variable called pipeline, and I put the file object into a variable called pipeline. I'm just doing the same thing here. But because I'm using the keyword as, technically this is called an alias. But I can use file now in subsequent code just like it's a variable. And you'll see this in Python all the time. In fact, there it is again. Now, the cool thing about these file objects is, well, that they're objects, right? Objects know things and objects do things. So the file object knows stuff about itself, and the file object can do things with itself. So it can go, just for example, go get the next line of data and bring it back to me. Now, that ability to go get the next line of data and the next line after that and the next line after that makes this file object technically an iterator. And that means a couple of things. Number one, we can put it in a loop, which we'll see here right away. But number two, we've seen iterators before. All of those things that we could put into a loop, like a dictionary or a list or a set or even a string. All of those things are iterators because they know how to get the next thing in their sequence. And so do files. Now, that maybe won't make much difference to us right now, but when we look at CSV files in the next lecture, we'll be able to use that to our advantage. Now, the cool thing, because it's an iterator and because I can put it into a for loop, that means I can use comprehensions. So you'll notice here that I'm not necessarily using read or read line or read lines plural, although I could. But now, because the file object is an iterator, it opens up to me the possibility of comprehensions. So here, I'm just using a loop for every line in that particular file. Strip off any of the white space, and we kind of know already, right, don't we, what's going to be back there. There's going to have that new line on the back end. That whole comprehension is in square braces, and so therefore we know it's going to be a list, and I'm putting that list inside a variable called words. And again, just to repeat, because that's the only and really the last line in the block, Python will close the file automatically for me when we're finished, which is really nice. Let's do a little work here in the terminal window. We'll play with that file. We'll use the with context generator, and then we'll jump over back to the slideshow. We'll look at writing data files really briefly. So I'm just going to use the same thing that we did before. So I'm just going to say with, oh, I can't spell that, open lexicon.txt as, I'm just going to call this now my file, just to make sure that we recognize that aliasing as a variable. So file doesn't have any special semantic meaning there. I'm just going to call that one as my file. Hit tab to indent, and I'm just going to create a new comprehension here. So I'm just going to say words are line, let's make that singular, strip for line in my file. And I can see how many words we get. I do the same thing. I could slice it. So let's just look at words. So I don't know where do we want to start. Let's just start at 110, and we'll stop before we get to 140, whatever that means. There you go. And now you can start to see all of the words that have come in. Now again, one of the really nice things about this, the ability to use a comprehension up here means that I can perform operations on my data as I bring it in from my file. So you maybe have already thought your way through to where I'm about to go, which is when we were doing comprehensions in the last lecture, we filtered the data by looking for all of the adverbs that ended in ly. So your question might be, can I do that as I import data from the file? And the answer is, of course you can. Why wouldn't we want to do that? So let's do that. I'm just going to hit the up arrow again to come back to my open. And now I'm going to say adverbs is a new list. It's going to be line, boy, I don't know why I want to make that plural. For line in my file, if line strip ends with, it's going to wrap around here, ly. Let's see how many I got. 6,209. That sounds like it was the last. I can't remember how many adverbs there's supposed to be. Let's just slice about 40 of those and take a look. There you go. There you go. So now I've got all of my kind of ly adverbs here. All right. So I know that this wrapped around a little bit, but I'm just going to highlight this here so that you can see it. So the cool thing about it, a couple of things. Number one, the with context manager closes that file for me automatically, so I don't have to worry about it. It aliases the file so that I can start to work with it. That alias is an iterator, which means I can put it in a loop, and if I have a loop, then I can use I can use comprehensions. So I think that all of that cashes out in this line right here, which is that now I can import data from an external file, but I have all the power of comprehensions at my disposal, which means I can start to filter data as I bring it into my program. And that is a really powerful feature. One last thing before we go, I'd just like to show you how to write to a data file. This might be something that you would want to do if you're collecting your own data, you're aggregating it, you're processing a whole pile of stuff, and you want to save it so that you don't have to do that processing all over again. So we can do that with the with context manager here in the same way that we were using read. So here I have a list of words. You'll notice hello and goodbye, and you'll notice there are some new lines there. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to open a new file called sayings.txt. And because I want to write to the file, I need to send it a mode. And we'll look, if you look in the earlier part of the lecture, W is the mode for write. And what write will do is if sayings.txt exists, it will erase all of its contents and start over. If sayings.txt doesn't exist, it will try to create it. Now you'll notice I'm aliasing that as file, and I'm using file here in the next line in my block, where I'm just writing lines to that file, and the lines I would like to write is the list of words. So we'll do this in the command line, and then you can see how that actually works. And you'll notice here, though, that it's our job to append that new line character to those various strings. That maybe is not necessarily obvious, but the first time you write a giant file and you don't get those new lines where you want them, you will remember. All right. One last thing. We have already seen here that \n creates a new line character. It takes a mere mortal n and turns it into a superhero n meta character. And the same for tabs, right? T is a normal mere mortal character. \T is a tab, which is special. Well, what happens if you have a quote or something like that inside your string? So here's the name of a poet, Seamus O'Haney, and you'll notice that he has an apostrophe in his name, and at least if I'm using straight quotes, I've got a single quote, Seamus O, single quote, Haney, single quote. So I have an odd number of single quotes. Python is going to flip out about this, and it's not going to know what to do with it. Now, what we did with a mere mortal character to turn it into a meta character was to put a \/ on it. But that process works in reverse. I can take a meta character and put a \/ in front of it to turn it into a mere mortal character. And now, in this case, what Python sees is that the apostrophe in O'Haney is not a meta character that ends the string. It is just a mere mortal apostrophe, and so Python won't flip out about that. So this can be a really handy thing. Could you put that in double quotes too? You sure could, but as we're going to see in the next lecture, what happens if my string has both single quotes and double quotes? How do I get around that sort of thing? So this idea of escaping non-special characters is a pretty important piece of managing your data in Python. All right, well, let's flip over to the command line. All right, just a little work here in the command line, and then we'll be done. So back in the Python interpreter, here's what I would like to do. I would like to create a list of people, and then I will write that list of people to a file. Now, as I create it, you'll notice what I've done here, right? There's some problematic people here. Seamus O'Haney, again, has that apostrophe in his name, but because I do not want Python to see that as a string-ending meta character, I \/ it. Bill Shakespeare's not problematic, and then the infamous rogue Goofus O'Mulligan, he's got exactly that problem too. But if I ask Python now what people are, you can see that Python treats those apostrophes properly. In fact, it kind of is pretty smart, right? It uses double quotes and single quotes in there. Perfect. Now, we already know too that if I want to write this list, if I want to write these people to a file, I need to add a new line to each one of those elements. Well, I can do that with a comprehension. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to overwrite people. So I'm going to say it's person plus a new line character for person in, oh, I can't spell in, can't spell in, people. Oh, that was hard. All right, let me try the up arrow and we'll get it a little easier here. We go through. All right, there you go. Now you can see there's a new line character at the end of each one of those. I'm just going to use the with context manager, and I'm going to write that out. So I'm just going to say with open people.txt, and now I need to send it a mode, and because I want to write this data into that file people.txt, which doesn't exist, by the way, I just need to send it a flag. I need to send it a mode. Again, W for write. I was going to call this as my file, and then what I'm going to do is my file, which I can't spell, write lines people, and probably it has worked. So let's check it out. It's going to dump out of here. Let's do a listing. So you'll see I've got lexicon.txt, which we used. I've got men and women CSV, which is going to be for the next lecture. And there, lo and behold, is people.txt. So if I catalog that, there you go. You can see that I've got all of my people right there in my text file. Perfect. All right. Well, that's it for reading and writing data files. The next lecture is going to be about comma-separated values files, which are a special case of reading and writing data, and Python has a special way to handle that. All right, thanks.